Chasing Lincoln's Killer, Chapter 5, Part 2. With the president's medical condition stable for the moment, Dr. Leal sent messengers to fetch Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son, Surgeon General General Joseph K. Barnes, Lincoln's family physician, another surgeon, and the president's pastor, the Reverend Dr. Phineas T. Gurley. Leal sent a hospital steward in search of a special piece of medical equipment, a Nelaton probe. There was work to do inside Lincoln's brain. Ignoring the danger of the surging crowd, Stanton pushed through, up the stairs, and into the back bedroom of the Peterson House. The sight of the president shocked him. He did not need doctors to tell him what would happen. Abraham Lincoln was going to die, and there was nothing the doctors could do about it. But he could do something for the president. He could protect and defend the country. Stanton took charge, making the back parlor of the Peterson House his field office. He would not return to the War Department yet, but would remain here. Stanton believed that Lincoln and Seward assassinations had exposed a Confederate plot to kill the leaders of the national government in an attempt to reverse the results of the Civil War. Stanton and his lieutenants assumed that all the cabinet's heads had been marked for death that night, and a rebel army might be advancing on Washington at that moment. Stanton wanted his commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant, back in Washington. He sent a telegram to order Grant back to Washington at once. It was the first telegram issued from the temporary War Department headquarters at the Peterson House. Stanton ordered troops to turn out into the streets, the guards to be doubled, military forts to be alert, guns manned, and special guards to be posted around the old Capitol prison. Clear away the mob from the street in front of the house, Stanton ordered. Soldiers tried to push back the crowd from around the foot of the staircase. The immediate area secured, Stanton turned to his second mission, launching the investigation into the crimes that had occurred at Ford's and the Seward House. He was determined to catch the criminals. He made it clear he was in charge. Later, when Vice President Johnson arrived at the deathbed, he remained in the background and chose not to take charge. In the days to follow, newly sworn-in President Johnson left it to Stanton to bring Lincoln's killer and his accomplices to justice. Stanton had witnesses from Ford's Theater brought before him. One witness after another swore it was Booth, John Wilkes Booth, who had shot the president. Stanton's operators could wire news and orders all over the country, and soon telegraph lines across the nation were announcing the news. The president had been assassinated and the Secretary of State attacked. Messages were telegraphed to Baltimore, New York, and beyond. Search the trains, guard the bridges. Orders were sent to commanders in the field of Virginia, chasing down leads based on early but false information Stanton received from tipsters. In need of help, at 1:10 a.m. on April 15th, Stanton sent a request to the chief of police in New York City asking him to send his best detectives to assist in the investigation of the assassinations. He continued to expand the search, activating manhunts in Delaware and Pennsylvania. Booth was identified to detectives as the assassin. Orders were sent to cover possible water escape routes. Cavalry rode to the Occoquan River to intercept anyone who attempted to cross. Fishermen along the river were notified to keep watch for Booth. The hunt had begun in earnest. Back in Washington, Army Major General Halleck made plans to imprison the assassins when they were caught. If Booth was captured, the Army would have to protect him from Lincoln's avengers, rampaging mobs of vigilants who might storm the old Capitol prison if they discovered Booth was jailed there. It was too risky to imprison Booth anywhere on land. Halleck issued an order: if the assassins are caught, put them in double irons and take them to the commander of the Washington Navy Yard, who will confine them to a monitor warship anchored there. The river would protect Booth from the angry citizens of Washington. Now all they had to do was catch John Wilkes Booth, Lewis Powell, John Surratt, David Harold, and George Azerodt. The doctors probed Lincoln's bullet wound with their bare, dirty fingers, sticking their pinkies inside Lincoln's brain. They used the Nelaton probe to find the bullet for possible removal, as if that would have helped Lincoln. Eventually, the physicians gave up their tinkering and simply monitored Lincoln's heartbeat, temperature, and breathing. While Lincoln still lived, the manhunt was already underway. At Ford's Theater, the Derringer pistol, the murder weapon, was recovered from the floor of the president's box. Soldiers and detectives rushed to Booth's room at the National Hotel. Of course, Booth was gone, but they searched his trunk and discovered an incredible and mysterious letter to Booth signed only Sam that described a large conspiracy against the Union government. Several blocks from the National Hotel, just a few hours after the assassination, a group of detectives showed up at Mary Surratt's boarding house. In the chaos in the streets outside Ford's Theater, one or more sources reported that John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt were close friends, and that Mrs. Surratt's boarding house was just a few blocks away. A boarder and school friend of John Surratt, Louis Wakeman, was the first to appear at the door to respond to the patrol's arrival. The detectives announced their mission. They were there to search the house for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Wakeman knocked on Mrs. Surratt's bedroom door, telling her that detectives had come to search the house. She instructed Wakeman to let them in. Wakeman seemed not to know why the house was being searched. One detective revealed the shocking and half-false information to the occupants of the Surratt's boarding house. John Wilkes Booth has shot the president, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State. Wakeman told the detectives John Surratt was not at home, but in Canada, and offered to help them with their investigation. Mary Surratt claimed not to know where her son was. The detectives searched the house, then left, leaving Wakeman, Mary, and her daughter Anna behind. Throughout the night and into the early morning, Mary Todd Lincoln made regular visits to her husband's bedside. At one point she wailed, "Oh, that tiny little Taddy might see his father before he died," then fainted, falling to the floor. Stanton, startled by her cry and fearing that the president had died, rushed into the room and called out loudly, "Take that woman out and do not let her in again." She did not deserve that cruelty. It did not matter. Stanton was obeyed. After riding half the night on the deserted road south of Surrattsville, Booth and David Harold neared their destination, an isolated farmhouse a few miles north of a village called Bryantown. A city-dwelling night rider unfamiliar with the remote area might have missed the turnoff in the dark, but Booth rode confidently ahead. He had been here before. There appeared a handsome two-story house in the distance. Booth recognized their sanctuary at once. They could rest here. They would not be rushed as they were at Surratt's Tavern, which was much too close to Washington and possible pursuers. Here, further south and in the darkness of this remote countryside, they could rest, eat, and sleep. And Booth could get medical care for his injured leg, which he was sure was broken. He needed to renew his strength after being awake for almost 24 hours. He was dog-tired, and his weary body ached from 5 bumpy hours on horseback. The spring night air was still and eerily silent. Booth and Harold approached the farmhouse. No barking dogs warned of their arrival, and the slow pace of their horses' hooves failed to awaken the 6 people sleeping in the house. Harold dismounted and walked to the house while Booth remained in his saddle. The assassin was alert for signs and sounds of danger. No lamplight shone through the window into the front yard. David would not have to wake the people inside. He knocked on the door and waited for signs of life within the house. The loud rapping awoke the farmer, who was alarmed at being wakened in the middle of the night. The farmer rose from his bed, walked to the front door, and called, "Who's there?" to the person on the other side. "2 strangers," replied David Harold, on their way to Washington. One of their horses had fallen, he claimed, throwing the rider and breaking his leg. Hesitating, the farmer peered through the window, then unlocked the door. In his front yard, he saw 2 men about 20 feet away, standing under a cedar tree. He approached them. Booth relaxed at the sight of a familiar face. The farmer helped Booth dismount, offering support when the fugitive's body weight bore down on his injured leg. Booth grimaced in pain when his feet touched the ground. He staggered into the arms of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. Their faces only inches apart, Mudd helped Booth limp up the steps and into his home. Harold tended to the horses, then followed Booth and Dr. Mudd inside the farmhouse. Harold was a stranger to Mudd. The doctor had never laid eyes on him before, but Booth was not. The chain of events that led John Wilkes Booth to Mudd's farm in the pre-dawn hours of April 15, 1865, began 6 months earlier in Montreal, Canada. By late 1864, Booth had hatched the risky plan to kidnap President Lincoln. He attempted to recruit accomplices in New York City, a place where there were many Lincoln haters and Confederate sympathizers. Booth knew the city well, of course. He had acted there many times.